because we got Lyricon next month, so next week. Next week. Do we have anything scheduled for next month? I don't think so. Maybe it's the social. Sounds like it's usually when you do the social. August is normally the social, so keep tuned for that. Other than that, David's going to talk to us about better entities getting more free domain objects. Hey.
Hello. I realize that probably most people here are probably Laravel and Active Record-y type people, so well, I think some of this could still apply, but it's an alternative.
Some of us came from Symfony.
we forget about Zen. So all these slides and example code is all up on my GitHub, so you can download it and go over it. I did test out a couple of them. There is some source code. It's not very easy to see on the screen, unfortunately. It's a bit too washed out.
Is the audio there too?
He's going to be uploading it apparently, so you'll be able to do that.
I'll stay for the audio.
There are extensive notes as well with the slides, so it's not like it's just the slides or anything. So there's all that. So the first thing is to do is just do a quick recap about what is an entity and why we would use them and what the role of an entity is. Basically, an entity is a thing that has a continuous thread of identity within your application. So its properties might change, but its the thing which identifies it does not change. So if you think about a person, well, a person's name can actually change. Their age obviously changes every year. You can, strictly speaking, change your date of birth if you really want. So you need some other form of identity for them, which could be social insurance number, or you might just assign arbitrarily a UUID, or something like that. But that won't change. It's always going to refer to the same person. And we want to do this to encapsulate that aspect of our domain. And it really does come out of the whole domain-driven design philosophy, and it's part of that terminology. And the big part of it, obviously, is that an entity is responsible for what it means to be valid. How is that entity to be used, the APIs that it exposes, what you can do with it, and how it's supposed to be used. And you can get quite far into it with sort of, which is what we're going to look at in today's session. Obviously, it's from DDD. There's two main resources: the Blue Book by Eric Evans, Domain-Driven Design, Tackling Complexity in the Heart of Software, and Vernon Vaughan, which is Implementing Domain-Driven Design, which I find is a little bit easier going, although they're both very dry reading. And you kind of have to read them out of order as well, because they don't actually explain the terminology up front. They kind of do a little bit and then do something else, and then a bunch of the terms. So it helps to read some of the later chapters first and then go and start reading the front of it. But if you want to read more, those are the two main resources on domain-driven design. So here is, and so I was saying, unfortunately, it's not quite. It looked fabulous on my screen at home, but sadly not so.
More whiteboards.
Yeah. This is a typical entity as it would be represented from our friends at Symfony, and the actual example that I decided to use is actually cribbed from their own documentation. It's linked in the presenter notes. There's actually a copy of it in the repo, so you can actually see. It's not quite their exact specific example. I did hack around with it a bit, just to add some extra stuff in, because it was a little bit too basic. But the general gist of it is that it's fairly stripped down. There's a bunch of usually private protected properties, because that's what Doctrine prefers. Some form of very simplistic constructor, getters and setters, and then annotations all over the bloody place to do everything from doctrine mappings to assertions to who knows what else. Then in some cases there'll be life cycle methods. There's tons of examples from the Symfony community and also doctrine as well. But we have problems with the way in which these things get structured. Principally, what is it supposed to do? Is it just a plain data transfer object? Because if it is, that's not really an entity. It's like we're kind of sacrificing what it's supposed to be for the sake of just doing some basic data transfer. If that's what we want, there are much better ways of doing it. The annotations really do add other responsibilities. Like, an entity doesn't need to know how it's persisted. It shouldn't know anything about persistence. It doesn't matter how you persist the thing. It's something which exists within our domain. And we worry about persistence later, but if the moment you start sticking the doctrine annotations in it, you've now directly coupled it to your database structure, and it's not appropriate. The bigger problem which comes out of that, obviously, is then the auto-generated getters and setters. Well, if you set a property of it, how do you know that that's actually a valid thing to set? Like, can you set, in this example, the slug at any point in the life cycle of this entity? I don't know. You can just call set slug and you can change it. But is that a valid change? Who knows? Worst with the Symfony examples is they like to use the @assert annotation for validation logic. But the problem there is that if you do it through an annotation and you don't use Symfony, your validation does not work. So you can do anything with this object and it's now in an invalid state. So presumably you don't care about your data. I don't know. Generally speaking, the stuff which I get involved with, the quality and the integrity of our data is extremely important. So, you know, why do we encourage this? I honestly, I don't know. I guess convenience. I don't particularly find it convenient. I've never bothered to learn the annotations personally. And it's not like Active Record gets away scot-free either. That's just as bad. In fact, in some cases worse, because now it's an undefined container of stuff. And then unless you've put app property declarations, which don't actually necessarily mean that's what's contained within it, because you can custom do select and add other stuff to it. And you can access those things arbitrarily. To stop that is really difficult in any Active Record implementation. This one is Eloquent, but PHP Active Record and the other variations thereof, including cakes, are equally obnoxious for doing this kind of mess of stuff that doesn't really have any particular meaning. And it can change, obviously. It always reflects whatever the current state of your table happens to be at that moment in time, or rather what select clause was run. And yeah, these are problems when we want to actually, have a nice to work with descriptive thing that's actually part of our business. Our entities should be part of our business. They are modeling what our business is trying to do. And last comment there, yeah, we can't maintain any notion of state. Like, has it been changed? What way was it changed? Was that the way it was changed? Was that actually, should that have been allowed? We can't really do very much about it. So, let's go back to our example from Symfony. And the first thing we're going to do, making them better, is going to get rid of all the annotations. Those specifically are anything that's just like @orm, @assert, we'll strip them all out. Now, I actually like dot block comments for the type hints, so I will actually leave those ones behind, like the @vars and stuff like that. I find those useful for my IDE. Some people don't. that's down to personal preference. At that point, though, they are just purely for help. They're not trying to convey additional meaning. You can split that one whichever way you want. So the actual annotations, particularly in Symfony, well, they're not code. I don't care what anybody says. A dot block comment is not code. You can't treat it as code. Yes, you can get it from reflection, but guess what? It's still a comment. Get comment, I think, is the actual method. So it kind of says it all there. Worse, it tightly couples your entity to the framework. But if this is a proper entity, it shouldn't care what framework it was created in. You should be able to take this code and run it. You know, obviously, if you're going to use Doctrine for persistence, you're going to have some concessions for Doctrine, but you should be able to run it. As long as you've got Doctrine, you should be able to run it under Symfony, under Laravel, under Zend, under Cake, if you really wanted to do that. And it should still function. Obviously, all those ORMs and some of the other esoteric ones really decrease the readability of the class. I should have found it, but I did at one point see a 40-line comment block on a property in a class. So you can really go overboard. It adds nothing, really. Of course, the annotations themselves are on yet another configuration language, which has their own quirks, and it has its own escape syntax, and all that other stuff that goes along with that. And we've already had to deal with like INI and YAML and XML and straight PHP, and what format is the straight PHP? Is it actually nested arrays, or are we using static method calls or whatever? So it's just something else, and we don't really want to be concerned with that. So my preference is always to use config files, especially for mapping. Mapping information, always have them separate, keep it clean, because then you can actually expose the domain language, which is ultimately where we want to get to. So next is we need to do something about state, and the easiest thing for that is just don't allow people to arbitrarily set anything. So you get rid of them all, get rid of every setter, don't need it. So we actually want to control how we're going to make changes to this thing. So getting rid of the setters means that we can define exactly how people should interact with our entity, and we can prevent the thing being placed into a, for the most part anyway, an invalid state. And the side effect of, obviously, is that we're going to get a much cleaner API for our object, because there's just simply less methods. So that does raise a question, though, of how we're actually going to set these properties. And for when we're creating, obviously, the easiest way is require them when you actually build it. Because in this case, the post, when we plan out our objects, we've decided that a post is only valid if it has a title, a slug, and the piece of content to go with it. If it doesn't have those three things, it's not a post. It might be that the content is to be inserted, but that's still its content. So we can enforce that through the constructor, and then through named constructor methods. And so this is a couple of nice side effects by enforcing a private constructor, in that you now actually have to create it through these specific methods. So you can actually add additional behavior and do other sort of initialization-y things, keep the constructor nice and clean. There's no identity in this, though, which we haven't really discussed. So how we would set the identity for this entity. And that would be entirely up to your particular domain. Normally, you would probably want to inject it as a required parameter, like a UUID or some other identity scheme that you come up with. You would pass that in as a constructor argument. So that's great. We can now build the thing, but we still need to make changes to it. So rather than just allowing our setters to do anything, instead we'll actually implement very specific state change methods. Like we're going to specifically allow it to go from one state to another, and that's encapsulated in a single method. The return void, can't chain them, and just do exactly what is needed to be done. So publish, unpublish, however, whatever you want to call that, if that's removed from publication. I struggle over naming. If it's unpublished or not, I couldn't think what the actual terminology was for it. Delisting or removed from publication was the best thing I found for it. Changing the title and slug, or replace content with two separate operations, because you can change the content without changing the title. So the nice thing with this, though, is that we can start to use our domain language to actually reflect what we are doing with it. We can actually communicate with other developers and non-developers what it's actually doing, as opposed to like set title, set content, or set some weirdly named thing. A non-techie could read that and go, oh, okay, so yeah, it's going to set some content, or it's going to set the body content, or it can actually, they won't necessarily know what it's actually doing, but they can read it and it sort of flows. That's really critical, because what we want to be able to do is to communicate with the business as a whole, and that comes through the domain language. Kind of skipped over the whole section of ubiquitous language, which is perhaps the biggest part of domain-driven design. If you haven't ever done that, I heartily recommend reading about it, because as technical people, we struggle with communicating with everybody else. If you've ever had to deal with sales and marketing people as a direct one-to-one, you will know how challenging that can be. And that's largely because we as techies want to use our language for everything. But that's not what the business will use. That's not what our salespeople will use. So rather than try to train them in our terminology, which they're just not going to, because frankly they're lazy. Sorry. They just don't have the time for it, and it's actually their realm of knowledge. We should adapt to that. So we should adopt whatever language it is that they're using, and actually get them to define what they mean, because then we can then refer to that in our code. We can codify it, and so when someone says, "Oh, I need so and so," it's like, "Oh, so you mean it's in this thing and it's this thing?" Oh, yeah, that's exactly it. And that's going to be unique for every particular project. There might be some things which are similar, but generally speaking, your language is going to be unique for every project that you come to. Particularly if you're in some field like I've recently found in commercial real estate, has a whole slew of very jargony sounding words which actually have very specific meanings, and they are reflected in our application code. And if their meaning starts to change, I update it. If that means changing methods or changing properties, then I do that, even though it's going to incur issues for the refactoring. But it means that I can still communicate with our salespeople and our CEO, and we can actually properly talk about the problems we're trying to solve. This is really important, and obviously it's a much bigger topic for discussion, and it's probably something which we could do through a couple of sessions, actually do some event storming and actually build our own domain, because it's quite a lot of fun.
Can I ask a question?
Sure.
You say use the domain language, and I see these examples for this class post, yeah? You don't risk having too many methods?
You can reduce down. There are ways that you can reduce the number of methods in your class. Generally speaking, people say you shouldn't have too many, but then what is too many? If you've got a lot of methods, then maybe your object is doing too much and it needs simplifying. We're actually going to, in a couple of slides, look at ways of even changing this so that it actually simplifies things further. It's very specific though. I know that PHP Mess Detector and Code Sniffer have rules about no more than 10 public methods by default or something. But really, it might mean that you actually do have 10 methods. If you're doing strict DDD with clearly defined aggregates, you might have 10, 12, 20 methods, because it's all about manipulating your domain. So if that answers your question.
Yes, thank you.
Right. We can go further with this. You can see that I'm using PHP 7's scalar type hints. I think the jury is still out on how useful those are. Which is actually the topic of the next slide. Things like addresses. You can usually have an address type, whether it's a home address or a business address, or shipping address or billing address. These are types, but the type is always going to be a specific subset, and usually we just go, it's a string, fine. The next step up might be, okay, we're going to actually use a constant, but still pass the string in. It's just a constant that we're using. There's a much better way to actually validate it though, using enumerations that other languages actually have as a thing, but have been implemented in PHP. The library I like to use is Eloquent Enumeration, which has nothing to do with Laravel Eloquent. Turns out that Eloquent is a Australian-based thing, and they just have an enumeration library. There are some other ones as well. That's the one which I've worked with most. Nice thing with enumerations though is that you define through constants what's there, and it can only be that list of constants. You can't change it. They're immutable. You can then type hint that enumeration. So you can only pass in an instance of a just type. And there's the example you can see just below it, I hope. It uses call static, unfortunately, so it does mean if you want autocomplete, you have to use the @method annotation. But you can basically then go address type, colon, in capitals, whatever the constant is, so home underscore address, and it will give you back an address type object that you can then pass in to your entity. And you will always know that it's always going to be a specific address type. Well, it always will be an address type, and it will only be one of the values that you've got, so you don't have to actually then test in your entity if it's valid. So it can save you a lot of time and effort. These things you can refactor, especially if you've gone through and done the @method declarations, so you can actually use the refactoring tools, change the names of it, so it makes it a lot easier than trying to find references to a particular string or even constants, which they're better, but enumerations do add that extra level of validity. And of course, we can name them after our domain language. It's useful. It's not necessarily always practical, but it's useful. The next topic, though, is the one which is sort of more interesting. It's validation. I tend to think of validation as being two aspects. There's the actual thing itself, what it means for the entity to be valid. But then there's that extra layer, which is what it means for the application to be valid. So our entity might be concerned with, is it a valid email address in terms of, does it actually conform to the horrific email regex? But we don't actually care if it actually exists. Or the username in our entity, does it fulfill our username criteria of max length, min length, or whatever? But we don't care if it's unique or not. That's not the realm of responsibility of our entity. That's where our application logic would enforce that. In our entities, what we're more interested in is asserting that the data we're passing into it falls within more generalized rules, like it's not empty, it's not longer than a particular length. And I think this is a perfectly valid use of this type of validation check. In this case, I'm using Benjamin Ebele's assertion library, which allows you to do very fast, simple assertions, so it doesn't do anything particularly complicated. It's very lightweight. It doesn't have any other dependencies, I think, so I think it's acceptable to be used within the domain code. Alternatively, obviously, you'd use PHP's built-in filter library and do it that way. But I dislike having to retype lots of stuff like that. I like the fact that it's a fluent interface. So we can actually then now validate our entity with whatever generic rules that we want to set. So there's some examples there, like the title can't be empty and it's a maximum length of 100. The slug is not empty and the max length of only 64. It might be problematic if the slug is derived from the title, but they're separate at this point, so not so much of an issue. This will raise an exception if it's invalid, so the calling code can trap that and do anything that we want. We're not using any of the frameworks validation at this point either, so our only dependency is the assertion library itself. And if we really wanted to, we could actually go and roll our own and make it part of our domain. Some people actually do recommend doing that, but it comes down to your own discretion at that point. And again, the entity validation is not the same as application validation. You still need to validate that yes, this email is unique, or is actually you can actually contact this email address, or that the username hasn't been taken, or whatever other requirements there are.
I have another question about the use of exceptions. This is a debatable. I think the Go language doesn't have exceptions. They use error codes. But my question is anywhere in the domain-driven design books, the main one and the implementation one, do they?
Yeah, they use exceptions.
They advise using exceptions, or?
It's well, if you're trying to put your entity into an invalid state, then it needs to raise some form of error. Depending on the language, you should use whatever is acceptable for that language. In PHP, that would be exceptions. You could also use trigger error, I guess. The advantage with exceptions is that you can catch them and you can run additional logic in the calling code rather than just letting the entire application bomb out. Again, it comes down to personal preference. I probably don't use them enough, I think. I like to tailor my exceptions to the type or the area where I'm actually raising it. So I'll not just raise a generic exception, I'll raise, like in the case of my domain, it might be some specific exception about a domain state that's not correct, so that it can be caught in the calling code. It depends.
I guess the school against the exception is that sometimes you might not catch one, and the application will blow anyway. So
I'd rather the application blow than continue running.
Yeah.
Because what's going to happen if it's in an invalid state? The outcome's going to be uncertain, and the worst case is that you're going to get a bunch of duff data, or you've just charged somebody the wrong amount of money, or not charged somebody. I have many years of experience of screwing up billing people. It is remarkably easy to do. So I would rather at that point the system actually raised an exception and shut down and not allow it to continue any further. How you do that? Yeah, if that's an exception, so be it. If it's actually triggering an error or early termination, exceptions are easier to handle, I think. But yes, you do need to know about them and then actually have specific code for them. So speaking of application validation, that's the point where we would actually use our application provided validation library, because we're going to be running their controls anyway, or console commands, so go nuts. I actually really like Laravel's form requests. I think they're really neat. And it's something which I kind of miss in the Symfony Flex stuff I've been doing recently. The general advantage of these things, we can do more complicated rules where we do need access to assistance or some other external validation service. Phone numbers, for example. It's actually really difficult to validate a phone number. A lot of people go, oh yeah, it's 10 characters, it's fine. Well, not if you're going to store a UK phone number, it's not. And not if you need to store international prefixes, it's not. And if you actually need the international access code, you probably need more like 20. And there's actually a library for doing that. Someone ported the Android phone number validator. So it's kind of nice. So you can actually use convert numbers to E164 format, install that, and then just represent it how you want to. Obviously, the application validation allows us to do like more involved stuff. We can do our access checks at this point. Can the user actually perform this action? Because that's, again, security is not something that belongs to our entity. That's its own layer outside of it. We can handle all of our uniqueness and the rest, and all that related gubbins. Which leads us on to the next topic, which can sometimes be a little bit contentious, which is value objects. What are they? Well, they are actually entities. They just don't. But their identity is through the properties. They should be immutable. If you need to make a change to it, you create a new one and dispose of the old one. You test their equality by comparing their properties, not by the actual object instance. So if you have two email address instances, they are equal if the two email addresses themselves are actually string equal, as opposed to one email address instance being exactly equal to another email address instance. We can use them to encapsulate the rules for what it means to be a valid email address in this example. So we can move all of that validation logic out of our entity into the value object, and then just say, we want an email address. And now our entity doesn't have to worry about validating it, because it has to be valid to even create the email address. You can take that further. You can actually group related properties together and treat them as a single unit. So if they change, you update all of them in one go. And it makes things a lot simpler and a lot cleaner. A neat trick that I learnt from Colin's Magic Methods talk he did. If you define an empty __ set method on a PHP object, you can no longer arbitrarily set any property that you want. So you can actually make a truly immutable object. So I've adopted that. Because otherwise you can create arbitrary public properties on any PHP object, including built-in types. If you didn't know that one, I don't recommend trying it. You will cause yourself pain. Important thing with value objects is they are actually things in your domain. They're not a library of resources that you pull in from somewhere else. You may decide to abstract some of the actual setup, like the empty is set, __ set, the toString, and have an abstract toString method. But they really are something that's critical to your domain. They represent something in your domain, so they should be named after that thing in your domain. And this actually matters, which we'll see coming up. And it's really important because there are a lot of actual value object libraries that you can use. But if the terminology that they use isn't what yours is, then it's not really going to help you. Some of them have abstract classes and you're supposed to extend them, but again, it's like that's part of your domain, so treat them as such. If you really want to, you can make these things final. to prevent anybody from changing them or enhancing them. That's your own preference. So yeah, dangers about them. They are part of your domain. So always use domain language. Never allow them to become mutable. They should always be immutable. Occasionally some people say, oh, but you can link in the parent entity, you can pass that in. Like, no, don't do it. Just forget it all about it. Treat them as just purely isolated, essentially value holders. Don't allow any state to be changed. So it kind of defeats the object of using them. Don't share them between your domains. Because a username in one application might not have the same rules as a username in another application. Like, how many of us use an email address as a username? That's fine, but if in your next application they actually have to have a non-email username, you're going to have to change it. So always be careful. Always re-implement in that case. Especially between projects. I'll try to avoid it, although the temptation is strong. Specifically because the validations can be different. So applying this to our post, there's actually a post author, which is on the original example code. We can create a post author value object which contains the name and the email address, which is itself a value object that represents our author. And we're actually going to name it post author because that's what it represents, and it'll expose the name and the email. And now we've encapsulated those two things together, so if we need to change the post author, we change both the name and the email address in one go. It's going to identify a single author. We can cast it to a string. We can type in that on our entity, and we can remove all the validation around setting a post author and an email, or can you have a post author with an email, or are they optional? We can get rid of all of that. We just want a post author. So using it, we can obviously change our type hints, inject it in, get rid of all of the other logic that would have been there. And now we can even start to change our accessor methods as well. Do we actually need to get the author? We're not really getting it. It's already there. It's just the author. So we can actually now just remove some of that language and actually start to use our domain language directly. So we have a post, we get the author, and the author has a name. If you want to do this in another language, just replace the arrows with dots. It's much nicer, it's much easier to read. It can convey a lot more about your domain and how the data is structured and related this way. So we can go back to our post and look at other things that we can strip out and possibly replace. And the content is another example. We can pull the content into a specific value object. We can add additional helper methods to it at this point because we're not changing it, we're just producing a different representation. So we could have a to-text or a way of generating a summary from that body of content. If this happens to be HTML, it might not be, it could be Markdown, who knows. But we can make those things, we can actually encapsulate that, and it's no longer in the post, it's related to the post content. So it keeps our APIs a lot simpler and cleaner. Possibly other things that we could do is, well, do we want the slug to be representative of the title? Should it always change if the title changes? If that's the case, then we could create a value object which takes the title and auto-generates a slug. And then it protects it from change. That will be up to a specific domain. There are issues with changing slugs and published content. Personally, I don't think slugs are particularly great as an identifier because they can change. So maybe as the unique identifier for the post, it's not necessarily a good field, and there should be a UUID or some other way of identifying it uniquely. So, we're making strides, but we can do better. We go back to our post and let's get rid of all of those gets as well. So we're just going to have direct access. I don't know, you're going to say, well, you could just do that by exposing the public properties. But if you do that, then you lose the control of being able to isolate changes to them. So the whole point of this is to keep a consistent interface so we can control how changes are being made to our entity. And we can add other stuff, the usual ones like is published, is recently published, those kind of interpretation, interrogation things, which often end up in view logic. You can pull those into the entity. Now, that does raise the actual issue of if you're actually adding those to your entity, which is more concerned with storage and data validity, and those more usually visual or front-end related methods, should they be in that entity at all? Which leads on to the whole topic of view models, because you really shouldn't be publishing your domain models to the UI. So that's a separate discussion. Now, at this stage, we've actually got quite a nicely encapsulated post object. We've tied down its interfaces. We've got very specific points where you can change it. You can only create it in a very specific way. With Doctrine, though, there's a little gotcha, and that's the case of dealing with collections. Because by their very nature, collections are mutable. So if you directly return it, any external code can modify that collection at any point, in any way. One way to guard against that, which I'm actually not doing yet, is to simply rewrap the internal collection when you expose it. And at that point you could, I suppose, wrap it in a different type of collection instead of the Doctrine one. That would be up to you. You can then add additional methods to it if you wanted to, in that case, reverse the comment order. Benefit of those is that now the actual internal collection, if someone, for example, started popping elements off that return collection, it won't affect the underlying entity. So if somebody happens to have a entity manager flush, it won't just suddenly delete a whole bunch of stuff. So it's going to protect you from that. Again, it does come back to the, well, really, should your domain entity be being passed to the view? Probably not. More fun stuff we can do, though, with our entity is decoupling and broadcasting of these changes, which we're going to do through domain events. So, domain event, like a value object, is an integral part of our domain. It reflects something that has happened. So they're always named in past tense. So post created, invoice raised, that type of thing. And domain event is just really basically a container of the things which changed. The important things which changed with this particular entity. They should be simple scalars, although you can actually pass in value objects because they're immutable, so it's generally fine. The thing to bear in mind is that a domain event might be serialized, so that's why you need to avoid complex types. And it should really only convey the bare minimum amount of information, unless you're doing something more complicated like event sourcing. which point you need to be very careful to ensure that you're actually recording the data that you need to. And we can fire these events, or at least raise them, at key moments. So at this point, create, when you update the content, publish, unpublish, changing the title on the slug. And then with those events, we can broadcast them and associate listeners, which could be, update search indexes, or send messages, or notify new people that, hey, there's a new article that's been published, or maybe it's to news aggregators say, no, this thing's actually been removed from publication. You need to remove it from your search indexes, that kind of thing. We can trigger even more domain changes. So we could have like posts being published, which could trigger some other thing, which might trigger like the author's credibility goes up, or it does some other logic outside of the scope of the post itself. And the just doing basic domain events is like the first itty-bitty step along the path to event sourcing. Key thing with these though is that these are not application events. These are actually from the domain. They should be handled differently. There's some people say that you should process them through a completely separate set of observer pattern type event dispatches. I personally just hook into Doctrine's event manager and use that. But they are and should be treated as part of your domain. So for dispatching them, obviously the easiest way is use your, even though I said not to, the easiest way is just use your framework's dispatcher and treat them as a standard event. The reason why a lot of this is you shouldn't really do that is Symfony actually has, and even Doctrine actually have typed events. You have to inherit from event args in Doctrine's case, and Symfony abstract event or event. They expect that as the base type, and everything is type hinged on it, which does mean that your domain event now has a dependency on an external framework, which is not necessarily where we want to be. I have since actually edited this so that I have a package which does an abstraction layer which converts the domain event into the appropriate event for Doctrine or Symfony. Laravel, thankfully, doesn't actually type in the type of the event. It just all it cares is if it can get shit from it, stuff from it. So that's actually was quite a nice thing to find out. Makes it a lot easier to integrate. So using Doctrine, a bunch of things which we want to hook into. Very importantly, pre-persist. If you don't hook pre-persist, you will not get any of the created events when you first persist an object. Because it's not registered to the identity map. The identity map only contains loaded objects. I found this out the hard way, so hopefully nobody else has to. Then pre-flush, we can then capture anything that has changed, that has been loaded, and obviously post-flush, which then we're actually going to dispatch the events. The nice thing about doing it through Doctrine is that when we actually dispatch the events in the post-flush, everything's been committed. Like the whole unit of work at this point is closed. So all the data we know has been successfully persisted to our data store. So when these events are fired, anything that's then going to load that information has the current state. You don't have to worry about things not being persisted properly, or events being fired yet it's not actually been saved. It's quite a nice little bonus that you get almost sort of kind of for free. Obviously at that point, when you're doing the dispatch, you can dispatch through a particular queue, Rabbit, or ZeroMQ, or Redis, whatever. And then obviously hook listeners in and start doing other stuff with them. And won't be able to entirely Skype read it. Some of the code from it. But the end result is that we end up with these really nice, really clean entities that actually convey what we want them to do. They self-validate, so you can't put them into an invalid state. They're always going to be initialized properly. So our data is always going to be have a high degree of integrity. And it really does make a difference. And you can actually go further with this, because should you really be using your entities to query them for information? Because really the entity is about managing data, not presenting the data. So the next step from this would actually be to strip all the gets from your entity and to implement view models. But that's a subject for another day. If you want more information, check out the Blue Book and the Red Book. Eric Evans and Vernon Vaughan. If you're interested in event sourcing, Greg Young's your man. There are lots of videos on YouTube, some really cool stuff with event sourcing. Obviously, Doctrine. I know we can get into ORM wars. My preference, I have a preference for Doctrine. I prefer it over Active Record because it works the way I want it to. I've never liked Active Record, any implementation. So it's personal preference. And there's a whole bunch of sample code of all of the slides. It's all in the GitHub repo there, along with the slides themselves and a lot of presenter notes to go along with it. So that's largely it. Any questions?
I was wondering with the event dispatcher, so you have many entities playing, yeah, and only one dispatcher, yeah. So then how you control, you know, you can get in like in a spaghetti of events to entities, something like that.
Yeah, that can be an issue. It's largely up to you to make sure that the order is not necessarily required. Normally what I do is before the events are dispatched, I collect them all together and sort them by the time that they were generated, which is using microtime. So down to nanosecond precision, I think it is, PHP. So they actually get fired in the order they were created. That doesn't mean to say that they're going to arrive in the order that they're dispatched. It's going to depend on your queuing mechanism. With Rabbit, you can set it up so that it will fire them in order and they will be received in order. But yeah, it's something which you've got to watch for. You can control that by not raising that many events. If you're raising that many, probably you're doing too much work. Maybe your aggregate, your entity is too complicated. Might be a sign that you need to actually change it, because obviously firing that many events is going to be resource intensive.
Point relationship, do you subscribe to a bounded context where you just store ID, or you're okay with having a pointer to another entity?
What, you mean sharing identity between bounded contexts?
It's sharing an entity, but if you have post and a user who wrote the post, are you going to have a pointer from user object to post object, or are you going to have an ID?
You would create a user identity value object, which encapsulates the user's identity, and share that. If you wanted to do it through a value object, but yeah, you'd use the actual identifier for the user rather than the user itself. Because the user would be a separate aggregate at that point. I'm skipping over a lot of the DDD stuff. Generally, entities are used within an aggregate, and the aggregate is what applies changes. So a post would be an aggregate because it contains other things. It's a logical representation. It's a transaction boundary. But a user that creates a post might have other things. It's not really concerned with the post. It just happens to own it. So you would share its identity through just its identifier. So it might be the user's UID or their username. Or you might use surrogate identity like the auto increment or cascade ID from, not cascade ID, sequence ID from the database. You can, but you're going to start leaking. Like, what if we want to now move the post to another server, but the users want to come from an authentication service? If you just are referencing the ID, it's a lot easier to do that.
I want to also clarify the difference between phone validation and entity validation. You had the email and a phone number. So did you validate them twice, or did you validate them in a specific way to specific?
Yeah, they're basically getting validated twice. The difference is that the entity is a more generic validation. Like the application might be, we only want email addresses from our company domain. But our domain layer is, it just needs to be an email address. Does it look like an email address? Okay, fine. That's great. If your application is that specific, you might move that logic down.
But you wouldn't go out of your way to like have the form somehow magically pull the validators that the entity uses to do it in one place. You wouldn't do that.
The library which I use to reference in here is really, really lightweight. There's very little overhead for using because it doesn't do database lookups. It doesn't like call into other libraries. It doesn't do like complex. You can do regex validation, which is probably not the most complicated thing you can do. That's not what it's designed for. So if you've got really heavy requirements on validation, then yeah, you need to put that up front. That's beyond the scope of what the entity can and should handle. Like if, it's a good example, phone numbers is actually a really good one. Actually validating that it's a properly formatted number, the library to do that is enormous. You don't want that in your domain. But you can do that externally and then simply say, have I received an internationally formatted phone number, the E164 format, which is a really easy check to make. But whether it's actually a valid phone number, as in you can call it, well, you don't really care about that at the entity level. That would be application level validation. You don't look convinced?
No, I'm fine. I have a facial issue. It's unimportant.
Any other questions? Well, I hope you enjoyed it. Like I said, all the code's up there. It's all unit tested.
I have one more question regarding example projects using domain-driven. That's what you refer there, or it's for this presentation?
This is just code for this presentation. There are example DDD projects. I'm not sure if there's anything specifically in PHP. There's certainly DDD Ruby, which is the they came up with this idea of a shipping application that I think may have come out of some of the work from Eric Evans. There's certainly a Ruby implementation of that, and also Java.
Do you know the name of the projects, or they are easy searchable?
If you search for DDD example app or example application, they should come up. There's starting to be a lot more of it now. It seems to really be like people seem to be adopting it a lot more readily. So there's a lot more questions being asked, and there's a lot more resources out there.
There's a pretty big course on Pluralsight. If you take .NET, it will be done there. They do a pretty good job. I find domain-driven design itself is something you're going to use usually on really big projects that have large teams and where you need to
problems in coding. But yeah, fully implementing DDD is very, very time consuming. It's not a fast process by any stretch. You can use it within an agile context, but it is a slow process because it does require all of this upfront domain discovery, planning, discussion. You really need people that really understand the business, or the specific part of the business that you're trying to write a solution for. And if you don't have that, if you can't get them to buy in, I wouldn't even attempt to implement it, at least from a technical aspect. The language definitely helps, and then some of the ideas of encapsulation, value objects are very, very useful. You can use that, but yeah, trying to actually do a full-blown implementation can be challenging.
I watched a few videos on DDD and also read some blogs and stuff. And what people are saying is, first of all, the blue book, the first book of Rick Evans, even here acknowledges that it's quite dry. If he were to rewrite, he said he will do it differently. So people are complaining that it's a steep learning curve to get around.
Yes. It is, and the books themselves, I'm still reading through Vernon Vaughan's implementing, and his writing style can be very, what's the word I want, trying, because he repeats himself constantly, over and over and over and over and over again, which can be a bit annoying. So instead of taking 5 words to say something, he uses 500. Which makes it unnecessarily verbose. And again, it's the order of the book itself doesn't give you enough knowledge up front to understand what they're talking about in the first 5 chapters. It's only when you get to chapter 6 and beyond where they actually start to explain what all of these things actually mean that you can actually go back and go, oh yes, okay, now I know what it actually understands and why you are doing this. So yeah, they could really do with some new material that's a bit better organized.
But the red book, I understand it is easier to grasp. Yeah.
Yeah, it has more practical examples. That's what it's based around. So it takes it from the point of view as a team and actually implementing a project collaboration software. So the challenges which they had and how they implemented them, they're actually looking at the various design patterns and practices and actually implementing them, example code and such like. So